Jake Morrison wiped the grease off his hands and looked around the empty docking bay of Outpost Kareth 9. 3 years he'd been here now. 3 long years of fixing busted engines and patching hull breaches for alien crews who barely looked at him twice. That's how it was for humans out here on the frontier. The galaxy needed bodies to do the dirty work, and humans were cheap and plentiful. Jake had stopped complaining about it a long time ago. The job paid enough to keep food in his belly and a roof over his head. That was more than a lot of folks back on Earth could say. The outpost itself wasn't much to look at. Just a glorified refueling station perched on the edge of nowhere, where the shipping lanes ended and the wild space began. Most days were the same. A ship would limp in with a busted thruster or a cracked fuel line. Jake would fix it. The crew would pay him half of what the job was worth. Then they'd leave without so much as a thank you. Rinse and repeat. It was lonely work, but Jake had grown used to the solitude. That particular evening, Jake had taken his small repair shuttle out to the nearby asteroid field. There'd been a nasty collision a few weeks back. An Imperial transport had clipped an asteroid and broken apart. The wreckage was still floating out there, and Jake knew there'd be salvageable parts worth good money. Waste not, want not, as his father used to say. He'd been picking through the debris for about an hour when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong out here in the silence of space. It was a chirping noise. Soft and desperate, like a baby bird calling for its mother. Jake froze, his magnetic boots holding him to a piece of twisted hull plating. Out here, strange sounds usually meant trouble. But this didn't sound dangerous. It sounded scared. Jake pulled himself along the wreckage, following the noise deeper into the broken ship's interior. Sparking wires hung down like vines, and shattered viewports let in the cold starlight. Behind a collapsed bulkhead panel, Jake found it. The creature was small, barely bigger than a house cat. Its scales shimmered in colors Jake didn't even have names for, shifting from emerald green to molten gold depending on how the light hit them. The little thing was hurt bad. There was a gash across its shoulder, and instead of red blood, it was leaking this luminescent liquid that seemed to glow from within. The creature looked up at Jake with eyes that stopped him cold. They weren't animal eyes. There was something ancient and knowing in that gaze, something that made Jake's skin prickle with recognition. This wasn't just some random space critter. This was something important. Jake knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle. He'd always been good with animals back on Earth. The creature didn't run. Instead, it made that chirping sound again, softer this time, almost questioning. Jake reached out carefully and the little thing pressed its scaled head against his gloved palm. Its body was warm, almost hot to the touch even through his suit. That's when Jake heard the voices. 3 figures emerged from the shadows of the wrecked ship. They moved with the confident stride of predators who'd cornered their prey. Jake recognized their species immediately. Bounty hunters from the Krek's homeworld, known throughout the frontier for their ruthlessness and their complete lack of mercy. They wore mismatched armor covered in kill tallies and carried weapons that looked like they'd been modified far beyond legal specifications. The leader was a tall, muscular reptilian whose face was a roadmap of scars. Half his head had been replaced with cybernetic implants that glowed with a sickly yellow light. The leader pointed a massive plasma rifle directly at Jake's chest. The weapon hummed with barely contained energy, and Jake knew it could turn him into vapor before he even had time to feel pain. His heart started hammering in his chest, but he kept his expression calm. Show fear to predators and they'd tear you apart just for fun. The hunter's voice came out as a low growl that Jake's translator implant rendered into flat, emotionless English. He explained that the small creature Jake had found was a dragon hatchling. Real dragons, not the fairy tale kind. Ancient beings of immense power who disappeared from known space hundreds of years ago. Everyone thought they were extinct or had retreated to some hidden dimension. Apparently everyone was wrong. A live dragon hatchling, the hunter said, was worth more money than Jake would earn in 100 lifetimes. Rich collectors across the galaxy would empty their vaults for a chance to own one. Jake looked down at the small creature that had pressed itself against his legs. It was trembling now, making soft frightened sounds that tugged at something deep in his chest. He looked back up at the 3 armed hunters. They had him dead to rights. He was one human with nothing but a plasma cutter on his tool belt. They had military-grade weapons and the experience to use them. The smart play was obvious. Step aside, let them take the hatchling, go back to his repair bay and pretend this never happened. That's what any sensible person would do. But Jake had spent 3 years watching the galaxy treat humans like they were disposable. Like they were nothing more than tools to be used and thrown away. He'd seen good people crushed under the weight of a universe that didn't care whether they lived or died. And somewhere along the way Jake had made himself a promise. He might not be able to change how the galaxy worked, but he could control his own choices. He could decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Jake straightened up and put himself directly between the hunters and the baby dragon. His voice came out steadier than he felt. He told them no. Simple as that. The creature was hurt and scared, and he wasn't going to let them take it. They could find something else to hunt. The words hung in the cold vacuum between them for a long moment. Then the lead hunter laughed. It was an ugly sound, full of contempt and cruel amusement. He told Jake that humans weren't even worth the cost of the ammunition it would take to kill him. This was his last chance. Move aside or die where he stood. The other two hunters raised their weapons as well, 3 barrels now pointed at Jake's chest. Jake didn't move. His legs felt like they'd been welded to the deck plating. Terror coursed through his veins like ice water, but he kept his feet planted. The baby dragon pressed closer against his legs, and Jake could feel its rapid heartbeat through his suit. Whatever happened next, at least he'd made his choice. At least he'd tried to be better than what the galaxy expected from him. The lead hunter's finger tightened on the trigger. The first plasma bolt screamed past Jake's head so close he could feel the heat through his helmet. Instinct took over before his brain could catch up. He scooped the baby dragon into his arms and ran. Behind him, the wreckage exploded into superheated fragments as the hunters opened fire with everything they had. Jake's boots magnetized and demagnetized in rapid succession as he sprinted across the broken hull, each step a gamble between speed and staying attached to the surface. The dragon weighed almost nothing in his arms, but it clung to his chest with surprising strength. Its small claws dug through his work suit, not enough to hurt but enough to anchor itself. The little creature was making these high-pitched sounds that cut right through Jake's heart. It was terrified, and Jake was the only thing standing between it and the monsters behind them. He couldn't let it down. He wouldn't. Another volley of plasma fire turned a cargo container to his left into molten slag. The heat wash hit Jake like a physical force, nearly knocking him off his feet. He ducked and rolled, his shoulder slamming into a piece of debris that sent a jolt of pain up his spine. The dragon chirped in distress but held on tighter. Jake scrambled behind what was left of the ship's engine assembly, buying himself maybe 3 seconds to think. His mind raced through his options. The repair shuttle was too far away. Even if he could reach it, they'd shoot him down before he got the engines online. The wreckage field was massive but finite. Eventually he'd run out of places to hide. The hunters had better weapons, better armor, and 3 against 1 odds. This wasn't a fight he could win. But maybe he didn't have to win. Maybe he just had to last long enough for something to change. Jake broke from cover and ran again. This time he headed deeper into the asteroid field, where the rocks were packed tighter and the shadows were darker. The hunters followed, their boots clanging against metal as they gave chase. They weren't rushing. Why would they? They knew they had him cornered. This was probably fun for them, like cats playing with a mouse before the kill. A plasma bolt caught Jake square in the shoulder. For a split second he felt nothing, just the impact spinning him around. Then the pain hit like a white-hot spike driven straight through his body. His arm went numb instantly. The smell of his own burned flesh filled his helmet, making his stomach lurch. Jake stumbled but kept his feet, kept moving, kept the dragon pressed against his chest with his good arm. He could hear the hunters laughing now. They were enjoying this, taking their time, making it last. Jake's vision started to blur at the edges. Blood was running down inside his suit, hot and sticky. His shoulder felt like someone had pressed a branding iron against bare bone. But he ran. What else could he do? The second shot hit his thigh and Jake's leg just gave out. One moment he was running, the next he was airborne, tumbling across the rocky surface of an asteroid. He hit hard enough to crack his visor. The world became a spinning mess of stars and stone and pain. When he finally stopped rolling, Jake couldn't feel his legs anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything except the small warm weight still pressed against his chest. The dragon was chirping frantically, its little body trembling against him. Jake forced his one good arm to stay wrapped around it. His body had become a shield. As long as he was between the dragon and the hunters, as long as he kept it covered, maybe it had a chance. Maybe someone would find it after. Maybe it would survive. His helmet display was flickering, showing him readouts he could barely focus on. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen levels nominal. Multiple trauma detected. Recommended action: immediate medical evacuation. Jake almost laughed. Yeah, that would be great. He'd get right on that. The hunter's boots crunched across the asteroid surface. They weren't in any hurry now. Jake tried to move, tried to crawl, but his body wouldn't respond. Everything felt distant and cold despite the burning pain in his shoulder and leg. He could hear their conversation, something about how humans always made things difficult, always chose the hard way. The lead hunter sounded almost bored. Jake felt the vibration through the rock as the hunter stopped right next to him. A boot pressed down on his injured shoulder and Jake's world exploded into fresh agony. He couldn't even scream. His lungs wouldn't pull in enough air. The dragon made a sound like breaking glass, high and desperate. Through the cracked visor, Jake could see the hunter's scarred face looking down at him. Those cold reptilian eyes held nothing but contempt. The hunter spoke, his words dripping with mockery. Called Jake stupid. Called him worthless. Said he was dying for absolutely nothing because they were taking the hatchling anyway. All this pain, all this blood, and Jake hadn't changed a single thing. Maybe the hunter was right. Maybe this was all pointless. Jake's vision was going dark now, narrowing down to a tunnel. He could feel his consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. But with the last of his strength, Jake looked down at the baby dragon still clutched against his chest. Its scales had stopped glowing. Its eyes were wide with fear and something else. Something that looked almost like understanding. At least he tried. That had to count for something. At least when the end came, Jake Morrison had chosen to be better than what the galaxy expected from him. He'd chosen kindness over cruelty. Protection over self-preservation. Maybe that didn't change anything in the grand scheme of things. But it meant something to him. Then the dragon's body suddenly erupted with light. Not the soft shimmer from before, but a brilliant golden radiance that blazed like a newborn star. Jake had to close his eyes against the intensity. The little creature opened its mouth and released a sound that Jake felt in his bones, in his teeth, in the core of his being. It wasn't the frightened chirping from before. This was something primal and ancient. A call that traveled not just through space but through dimensions Jake didn't even know existed. The sound pierced through the asteroid field, through the void of space, through the very fabric of reality itself. Jake's translator implant shorted out from the intensity. His ears were ringing so loud he couldn't hear anything else. The light from the dragon's body was fading now, or maybe Jake's consciousness was finally giving out. Everything was becoming fuzzy and indistinct. Time seemed to slow down. Jake counted the seconds in his head, though he wasn't sure why. 1, 2, 3. Each heartbeat took an eternity. Each breath was a mountain to climb. His body was shutting down, piece by piece, system by system. But some stubborn part of his brain kept counting. Somewhere around the 3-minute mark, Jake felt something change. The quality of light shifted. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a frequency that made his broken bones ache. Even through his dying senses, he could feel something massive approaching. Something that made the hunter's weapons seem like children's toys. Something old and powerful and absolutely terrifying. The sky above them split open like a wound in reality itself, and Jake's last conscious thought was that maybe, just maybe, his sacrifice hadn't been pointless after all. The fabric of space didn't just crack open. It screamed. Reality itself seemed to protest as something far too large forced its way through from somewhere else entirely. The portal that formed above Outpost Kareth 9 blazed with colors that shouldn't exist, light that seemed to come from beyond the normal spectrum. It was like watching the universe tear itself apart at the seams. Every single alarm system on the station went off at once. Proximity warnings. Radiation alerts. Gravity fluctuation sensors. All of them shrieking in mechanical panic. The few ships still docked at the outpost didn't wait for clearance or flight plans. They just launched, engines screaming as they pushed their reactors past safe limits. Captains who'd been trading insults in the station bar 5 minutes ago were now flying in the same direction. Any direction as long as it was away from whatever was coming through that portal. Jake was barely conscious, sprawled on the asteroid with the baby dragon still clutched to his chest. But even through the haze of blood loss and pain he felt it. The air itself changed. Started vibrating with a frequency that made his remaining teeth ache. The asteroid beneath him trembled like it was afraid. Through his cracked helmet visor, Jake watched something emerge from that impossible tear in space. She was beyond anything his mind could properly process. The dragon that came through the portal was over 3 kilometers from nose to tail. Her scales weren't just reflecting light, they seemed to be made of it. Condensed starlight given solid form, each scale glowing with the intensity of a distant sun. When she moved, reality rippled around her like water disturbed by something moving beneath the surface. Her wings unfurled, vast membranes that could have cast a shadow over an entire city. Each wing beat sent out shockwaves that Jake could feel in his chest. The creature's presence alone made Jake's brain rebel. His eyes couldn't quite focus on her properly. She was too big, too ancient, too fundamentally other for his human mind to fully comprehend. This wasn't just an animal no matter how large. This was something that existed on a level beyond normal life. A force of nature given consciousness and purpose. Aurelia, Empress of the Dragon Imperium. Even half dead, Jake's translator implant managed to feed him that information from the station's panicked broadcasts. She'd ruled for 3,000 years. 3,000. That was longer than human civilization had existed. She commanded fleets that numbered in the thousands. She'd fought wars that reshaped entire sectors of space. Empires that had stood for millennia had crumbled before her judgment. In the hierarchy of dangerous things in the known galaxy, she was in the top 10. Maybe top 5. But right now in this moment she wasn't an empress. She was a mother who'd heard her child crying for help. Aurelia descended from the portal with a grace that defied her massive size. She moved like a dancer, like a falling leaf, somehow making 3 kilometers of muscle and scale and cosmic power look delicate. The outpost should have been crushed flat under her weight. The asteroids should have shattered like glass. But she perched on the rocky surface with impossible delicacy, her claws finding purchase without destroying anything. It was like watching a mountain decide to land softly. One of her eyes swiveled to focus on the scene below. That eye alone was bigger than the repair shuttle Jake had flown out here. Larger than his entire workshop back at the station. It glowed with an inner light, ancient and knowing. That eye had watched civilizations rise and fall. Had seen stars born and die. And right now it was looking at 3 bounty hunters, 1 dying human and a small injured dragon hatchling. The temperature dropped. Not physically but something deeper. The kind of cold that settles into your soul when you realize you've made a terrible, fatal mistake. The 3 hunters stood frozen like statues. Their weapons hung limply in their hands. One of them had been in the middle of taking a step and his foot still hovered above the ground, muscles locked in place by pure primordial terror. When Aurelia spoke, it wasn't sound. Not really. Her voice bypassed ears entirely and spoke directly into the consciousness of every living thing within 100 kilometers. It resonated in Jake's skull, in his bones, in the fundamental particles that made up his body. The words carried weight beyond their meaning, each syllable heavy with power and age and absolute authority. She asked a simple question. Which of them had hurt her daughter? 4 words that contained an entire universe of threat. The question wasn't really a question. It was a final accounting. A last chance to confess before judgment was rendered. The hunters still couldn't move. Their bodies had betrayed them, locked down by instincts millions of years old that screamed one message: predator. Their rational minds might not have understood what they were facing, but their animal brains knew. They were prey. They had always been prey. And they had made the catastrophic mistake of threatening this predator's offspring. The lead hunter's jaw worked soundlessly. His vocal cords finally managed to produce something between a whimper and a word. He tried to explain. Tried to make her understand. They didn't know. They were just following a contract. Just doing their job. The hatchling was worth so much money. They hadn't meant any disrespect. Please understand. Please forgive. His words tumbled out in a desperate rush, tripping over each other. His cybernetic eye sparked and flickered. Coolant leaked from damaged implants. He was crying, Jake realized. This scarred killer who'd laughed while hunting Jake down was now weeping like a child begging for mercy. Aurelia's response was immediate and absolute. There was no dramatic build-up. No proclamation of sentence. No explanation of their crime. She simply decided they should no longer exist, and reality agreed with her. The 3 hunters didn't explode or burn or even fall down. They just stopped being there. One moment 3 figures stood on the asteroid, the next there was empty space. Not even ashes remained. Not even the echo of their last thoughts. They'd been erased so completely that Jake's brain struggled to remember what they'd looked like. It was like the universe itself had edited them out of existence. The casual totality of it was somehow more terrifying than any violence could have been. Aurelia hadn't even seemed to try. Hadn't made a gesture or spoken a word. She'd simply looked at them and decided they were no longer acceptable components of reality. And that was that. 3 lives, 3 histories, 3 futures, all gone in less than a heartbeat. Then that massive eye turned toward Jake. The full weight of Aurelia's attention focused on him like a spotlight made of stars. Jake felt his consciousness being examined, weighed, measured. He was dying. He knew that. Could feel his life bleeding out onto the cold stone. But even dying, even barely able to think, Jake felt the sheer magnitude of the intelligence studying him. This wasn't just smart in the way humans were smart. This was something beyond genius, beyond wisdom, beyond any scale Jake had words for. The baby dragon chirped weakly from where it lay against Jake's chest. That small sound seemed to mean everything in that moment. Aurelia's gaze shifted slightly, taking in the full picture. Her daughter wounded but alive. A human dying. And between them, a choice that had already been made. Jake lay crumpled on the asteroid's surface, each breath coming harder than the last. His arms were still locked around the baby dragon, though he couldn't feel them anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything except a spreading coldness that seemed to start in his chest and work its way outward. His helmet display had gone dark. Blood filled his suit. Through the spider web cracks in his visor, he could see that massive eye watching him with an intensity that should have been terrifying but somehow wasn't. Empress Aurelia had existed for 3,000 years. She'd watched the rise of civilizations that humans would consider ancient history. She'd been alive when species that were now nothing but fossils and legend had walked their homeworlds. In that vast span of time, she'd seen everything that sentient beings were capable of. The heights of nobility and courage. The depths of cruelty and greed. She'd witnessed heroes and monsters, saints and tyrants. She thought she'd cataloged every possible variation of behavior that conscious minds could produce. But this was something different. Something she hadn't expected. A human. Not just any human, but one from a species the galaxy had collectively decided wasn't worth respecting. Humans were everywhere in the frontier, doing the jobs nobody else wanted. Fixing pipes. Hauling cargo. Cleaning waste recyclers. They were cheap labor, expendable bodies too numerous to have individual value. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries teaching humans that they didn't matter. And yet here was one who'd chosen to die protecting her daughter. Not because someone was paying him. Not because he'd get famous or be remembered. He hadn't even known what the little creature was. He'd just seen something small and hurt and scared, and he'd decided that was enough. That was worth dying for. The purity of it caught Aurelia off guard. In all her centuries, acts of true selflessness were rarer than most beings realized. Everyone always had an angle, a reason, something they hoped to gain. But Jake Morrison had gained nothing except pain and death. Aurelia's voice came again, softer this time. Gentle in a way that seemed impossible from something so vast. She told Jake to let go. Told him he'd done enough. That he could rest now. Her words carried permission, absolution. Whatever happened next, he'd already done everything that could be asked of him. Jake's mind processed the words but his body wouldn't respond. His arms stayed locked around the baby dragon. He honestly couldn't tell anymore if he was still trying to protect it or if his muscles had just frozen that way. Everything felt distant now, like he was floating somewhere above his own body, watching everything happen to someone else. The pain had faded into a dull background noise. That probably wasn't a good sign. The baby dragon stirred against his chest. Jake felt it moving, felt those small claws releasing their grip on his torn suit. The little creature wiggled free from his arms and scrambled across the rocky surface toward its mother. Its movements were urgent, frantic. It reached Aurelia's massive form and started making those chirping sounds again, rapid fire, climbing up her scales like a child climbing into a parent's lap. Jake's dying brain assumed the dragon was telling its mother what had happened. Explaining about the hunters, the attack, the chase. But as Aurelia's expression shifted, Jake realized that wasn't it at all. The baby wasn't reporting. It was begging. Those desperate chirps weren't saying what had happened. They were pleading for what happened next. The little dragon was asking its mother to save him. Something changed in the air. Aurelia went very still, her massive head tilting slightly. Then Jake felt something touch his mind. Not physically. Deeper than that. It was like having someone gently open a door inside his head and step through. There was no pain, no violation. It felt more like being seen. Really, truly seen for the first time in his life. Aurelia's consciousness moved through Jake's memories like someone walking through a house. She saw everything. His childhood in the lower districts of Detroit where the buildings were old and the opportunities were scarce. His parents, working 3 jobs between them, still finding time to teach him that how you treated people mattered more than how much money you made. His father saying that character was what you did when nobody was watching, when there was no reward for doing right. She saw Jake's teenage years, watching his friends take shortcuts and make compromises. Saw him choosing harder paths because they were honest. Saw him working his first job at 16, fixing hover bikes in a shop that barely paid minimum wage. The owner had been skimming from the register. Jake had reported it even though he knew he'd lose the job. He'd lost the job. The memories continued, flowing past like a river. Jake at 20 taking the first transport off Earth that would have him. Working on cargo haulers. Spending years in ship engine rooms where the heat was brutal and the pay was worse. Seeing how the galaxy really worked. Watching other humans get cheated, abused, discarded. watching some of them become hard and cruel in response, watching others break entirely. And through it all, Aurelia saw the small kindnesses that Jake thought nobody noticed. The time he'd given his meal to a kid who was hungrier. The time he'd fixed a broken air recycler for free because the family couldn't afford the repair. The time he'd stood up for a younger worker being bullied by a foreman, even though it cost him a promotion. 1,000 tiny moments where Jake had chosen to be decent when cruelty would have been easier and more profitable. She saw a man who'd stayed good in a galaxy that punished goodness. Who'd kept his humanity in a universe that tried to strip it away. Who'd made it to 35 years old with his integrity intact despite every reason to compromise. Despite every reason to become bitter and selfish and mean. When Aurelia spoke his name, it resonated through Jake's entire being. Jake Morrison. 2 simple words, but they carried weight. Recognition. In 3,000 years, Aurelia had learned that names had power. Not magical power, but the power of acknowledgement. Of being seen as an individual rather than just another face in the crowd. Jake had probably gone weeks without anyone bothering to say his name. And now an Empress older than human civilization was speaking it with something that sounded almost like respect. She told him that her daughter was alive because he'd been willing to die. Stated it as simple fact. Then she said something that made Jake's fading consciousness flicker with surprise. Dragons do not forget debts. Those words carried the weight of law, of cosmic balance, of obligations that transcended species and time. Jake watched through blurring vision as one of Aurelia's claws extended toward him. Each talon was the size of a bus, gleaming like polished metal. Sharp enough to cut through starship hulls. Strong enough to crush buildings. That claw descended with terrible slowness, blotting out the stars above. Jake's oxygen-starved brain couldn't quite process what was happening. Was this mercy? A quick end instead of slow suffocation? That would be kind. He appreciated that. But the talon didn't strike. Instead it stopped just above him. Golden light began to pour from Aurelia's claw like liquid sunshine. It cascaded down over Jake's broken body, and where it touched him, warmth spread. Not the fading cold of death, but real warmth. The warmth of summer days and crackling fires and his mother's hugs from childhood. The warmth of life itself, flowing back into places it had been leaving. The light wrapped around Jake like a blanket, like arms holding him safe. The pain didn't vanish, but it became manageable, distant. His vision started to clear. His lungs pulled in air without that terrible rattling sound. Somewhere far away, Jake could feel his body beginning to heal in ways that shouldn't be possible. And through it all, that golden light kept pouring down, given freely by something ancient and powerful to someone the galaxy considered worthless. Everything went warm, and for the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison felt like he mattered. Jake's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. He was floating in liquid that glowed with a soft blue light, warm against his skin. But it wasn't water. The substance felt thicker, almost alive, and everywhere it touched him he could feel a gentle tingling sensation like mild electricity. The chamber around him wasn't made of metal or plastic. It looked like crystal, but the walls seemed to pulse with their own inner light, shifting through colors he was pretty sure shouldn't exist. He took a breath and realized he wasn't drowning. The liquid was filling his lungs, but somehow he could breathe it just fine. That should have been terrifying, but it felt natural, easy, like his body had always known how to do this. Jake lifted his hand out of the glowing pool and stared at it. The skin was unmarked. No burns from the plasma bolts. No scars. He reached up to touch his shoulder where he'd been shot and found nothing but smooth skin and healthy muscle. The wound in his leg was gone too. Everything was gone. More than that, he felt incredible. Strong in a way he'd never felt before. Like every cell in his body was humming with energy. Aurelia's voice resonated through the chamber, and this time Jake could hear actual sound mixed with that mind speech thing. She explained that he was in the restoration pools of her homeworld. Technology that was ancient when humans were still living in caves. She told him he was aboard her flagship now, that he was safe, that everything was going to be fine. The way she said his full name, Jake Morrison, made him feel like a person again instead of just another disposable worker. Jake pulled himself out of the pool, the glowing liquid sliding off his skin without leaving him wet. He found simple clothes waiting for him, made of fabric that felt like silk but was probably something far more advanced. Once dressed, he stepped through an archway that opened at his approach and found himself in a room that made his brain hurt trying to understand it. The observation deck of Aurelia's flagship was massive. The floor was made of the same living crystal as the pool chamber, but here it was transparent. Jake could see straight down into the depths of space below his feet. Stars wheeled past underneath him, making him dizzy until he forced himself to look up instead. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to shift between solid and transparent. And through them, impossibly, he could see Earth. His home planet hung in the viewport like a blue and white marble, close enough that Jake could make out the continents. But that was impossible. He'd been sectors away from Earth, out on the frontier where the shipping lanes ended. There was no way to cross that distance in the few hours or maybe days that had passed since he'd died. Or almost died. Whatever had happened to him. Aurelia's massive form coiled around the observation deck like a living mountain. Up close, Jake could see that each of her scales was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories. Her scales weren't just reflecting light, they were generating it, each one glowing softly from within. She looked at him with one of those enormous eyes and Jake felt that same sensation of being truly seen. She told him she was taking him home. Just stated it as fact like it was the most natural thing in the world for a dragon empress to personally chauffeur a human mechanic back to Earth. But before they arrived, she said there were things Jake needed to understand. Important things that would change everything. For 300 years, Aurelia explained, humans had been classified by the Galactic Council as Class 3 labor species. Jake had heard that term before but had never really thought about what it meant. Aurelia broke it down for him in simple terms. Class 3 meant useful but expendable. Good for manual labor, decent problem solvers, tough enough to survive harsh conditions. But not worth protecting. Not worth investing in. Not worth treating as equals. That classification had shaped every interaction humans had with the wider galaxy. It determined what jobs they could get, what rights they had, whether anyone cared if they lived or died. The classification had cost humanity everything that mattered. Trade agreements were written to exploit Earth's resources and labor. Defensive pacts excluded human colonies from protection. Advanced technology was kept out of human hands. Educational opportunities were limited. Jake had lived his whole life in the shadow of that classification without fully realizing it. Every time an alien crew had treated him like dirt, every time he'd been cheated on pay, every time he'd watched another human get abused with no recourse, it all traced back to those two words, Class 3. Jake felt the baby dragon before he saw her. The little creature bounded across the deck and pressed against his leg, making happy chirping sounds. She looked completely healed now, her scales bright and her eyes alert. She nuzzled Jake's hand and he scratched behind her horns, amazed that this small being was somehow the reason he was still alive. Aurelia continued, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was building to something important. She talked about how one human had made a choice that day. One human, when faced with death, had chosen honor over survival. Had chosen to protect something helpless even though there was no reward, no recognition, no rational reason to do it. That one choice, she said, had proven something the galaxy had forgotten. That humanity possessed instinctive goodness. That humans, despite centuries of being ground down and exploited, could still choose kindness when it mattered most. Then Aurelia dropped the bomb. She was using her authority on the Galactic Council to reclassify humanity. Not Class 3 anymore. Class 1. The highest designation. The category reserved for species that were considered fully sentient, fully valuable, fully deserving of rights and protections. Humans would get everything that classification brought. Access to advanced technology, fair trade agreements, defensive pacts, educational exchanges, representation on the council itself. The Dragon Imperium, one of the most powerful factions in known space, would personally sponsor Earth's entrance into the networks that mattered. Jake's brain couldn't quite wrap around what she was saying. He stared at her, then looked down at the baby dragon still pressed against his leg. His voice came out barely above a whisper when he asked if this was really happening because he'd saved her daughter. One mechanic, one baby dragon, and somehow that changed everything for billions of humans? But Aurelia shook her massive head. She leaned closer, bringing that enormous eye down to Jake's level. Her voice was warm now, filled with something that might have been respect or admiration. She told him he was missing the point. Yes, he'd saved her daughter. But what mattered was what that act proved. Jake had every reason to walk away. Humanity had been given every reason to become hard and cruel and selfish. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries teaching humans that kindness was weakness, that mercy got you killed, that looking out for yourself was the only way to survive. And yet Jake had chosen differently. Despite everything, despite all of it, he'd chosen to be good. If one human could maintain that kind of character in the face of everything the galaxy had thrown at him, Aurelia reasoned, how many more were out there just like him? How many other humans would make the same choice if given the chance? Jake wasn't an exception. He was proof of what humanity really was underneath all the exploitation and hardship. Aurelia told him he was living proof that humans belonged among the stars. Not as servants or cheap labor but as equals. As partners. As a species worthy of respect. She told Jake to go home and tell his people what had happened. Tell them that a mechanic on a forgotten outpost had changed everything for Earth. That one good deed had rewritten humanity's future. Jake looked at the baby dragon, who chirped happily and leaned into his touch. He thought about all the humans out there on frontier stations and cargo holds and engine rooms. People like him who were just trying to get by, trying to stay decent in an indecent universe. He whispered that nobody would believe him. How could they? It was too big, too impossible. Aurelia laughed, and the sound was like thunder rolling across distant mountains. She asked Jake what he thought would happen when she personally delivered him to United Earth Command headquarters with a treaty already written and signed. When a dragon Empress, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, showed up in Earth's orbit and declared that humanity was under her protection now. They'd believe then. They'd have to. She told him that humanity's time in the shadows was over. Finished. Done. And it had ended because one man had been willing to die for a creature that couldn't offer him anything in return. Because when it came down to the moment that mattered, Jake Morrison had chosen to be better than what the galaxy expected. Through the transparent deck, Earth was growing larger. Jake could see the lights of cities now, millions of humans going about their lives, completely unaware that everything had just changed. He realized he hadn't just saved a baby dragon that day out in the asteroid field. He'd reminded the entire galaxy what humans could be. What they'd always been underneath everything else. And maybe that was the most human thing of all.